Imagine a world where a single online conversation can spiral into deadly obsession, where the lines between reality and fantasy blur so dangerously that they end in murder. This isn't just a story about lies and betrayal, it's about how the anonymity of the internet can lead to the darkest corners of human nature. Today, we dive into one of the most chilling cases of online deception you've likely never heard of: the internet chat room murder, also known as the Talhat Blonde case. What started as a middle aged man's escape into a digital fantasy quickly unraveled into a nightmare of jealousy, deceit, and violence. Thomas Montgomery, a husband and father, created a fake identity to woo an 18-year-old girl online, but the truth behind the screen was far more disturbing. Before this story ends, an innocent man will be dead, and the shocking twist will leave you questioning everything you know about trust, obsession, and the dangers lurking behind a keyboard. Thomas Montgomery was the type of man you might overlook in everyday life, a middle aged factory worker from Buffalo, New York, living an ordinary, uneventful existence. His life was stable but predictable: a wife, two daughters, and a job he had worked for years. On the surface, nothing appeared out of place, but beneath this seemingly steady exterior, Thomas was grappling with a deep sense of dissatisfaction. As the years passed, the weight of an unremarkable life began to crush him, slowly eroding his sense of self-worth. Approaching his mid-40s, Montgomery faced what many would describe as a classic midlife crisis: the realization that youth was slipping away and that he had never truly lived out the exciting or daring life he once imagined haunted him. Feeling trapped in the routine of his factory job and the monotony of suburban life, he began seeking an escape. And like many in the early 2000s, he found that escape in the burgeoning world of online chat rooms. At first, the chat rooms were simply a place where he could shed his identity for a few hours each night, a place where he could be anyone he wanted to be. But this was no harmless diversion. Montgomery was about to lose himself in a web of lies that would not only shatter his life, but destroy someone else's as well. What began as idle chatter in an anonymous forum would quickly lead him down a path of deception, obsession, and ultimately murder. In the shadow of his crumbling self-esteem and dissatisfaction with his ordinary life, Thomas Montgomery found solace in becoming someone else entirely, a version of himself that he believed would be admired, envied, and desired. This alter ego was not just any man, but a young, strong, and heroic figure, a 20-year-old Marine sniper, fresh out of combat, experienced in war, and hardened by life's challenges. He called himself Marine Sniper. The decision to create this persona wasn't random. It was born from a deep yearning to be something more than the aging factory worker he saw in the mirror. Montgomery felt invisible in his real life, his role as a husband and father seeming more like a set of obligations than a source of fulfillment. In his mind, Marine Sniper was everything he wasn't: young, fit, and heroic. He would be someone who lived a life filled with adventure, danger, and admiration, things Montgomery never experienced but craved desperately. Through this new identity, he sought validation and excitement, filling the void left by years of routine and monotony. He crafted elaborate stories of his time in the military, drawing on the mystique and respect often associated with those who serve in elite units. His online chats painted a picture of a brave soldier, admired for his strength, valor, and youthful energy. Marine Sniper wasn't just a mask, he became Montgomery's escape from a reality that he no longer wanted to face. But this fantasy would come with a heavy cost. The deeper he went into this world of lies, the more detached he became from the real Thomas Montgomery. His desperation to be someone else, to be someone important, was pushing him down a dark path, one that would soon lead to tragic consequences. In the vast, anonymous world of online chat rooms, it wasn't long before Thomas Montgomery, under his new identity as Marine Sniper, caught the attention of someone who would change his life forever. Her name was Jessie, and she introduced herself as an 18-year-old high school senior from West Virginia. Young, vibrant, and flirtatious, she was everything Montgomery's fantasies thrived on. From their very first messages, there was an undeniable spark. Jesse seemed to hang on every word Montgomery said, captivated by the stories of his military exploits and his persona as a battle hardened Marine. To Montgomery, Jesse was the embodiment of youthful beauty and admiration, something he had longed for in the confines of his mundane life. The thrill of their conversations filled him with excitement that had been absent from his real world existence for years. Their chats quickly grew more intimate, evolving from light-hearted banter into deeply personal exchanges. Jessie showered Marine Sniper with admiration, calling him her hero and praising his bravery and strength. Montgomery, in turn, was more than willing to indulge her, weaving even more elaborate tales about his past, feeding the fantasy on both sides. To him, this attention felt real tangible in a way his fading reality could not compete with. Jesse, too, seemed to fall for Montgomery's charm, or rather, the charm of the persona he projected. They exchanged photos, she sent him pictures of a striking, blonde teenager, and in return, he sent her a photo from his youth, one where he appeared far younger and stronger than his middle aged self. Their bond deepened with every passing day, with Montgomery fully convinced that he had found something real, despite the obvious age gap. He believed he had captured the heart of a young woman who adored him, even if it was built entirely on lies. But neither Montgomery nor Jesse was who they claimed to be, and the relationship that was forming between them wasn't just built on deception, it was headed for disaster. As the relationship between Marine Sniper and Jesse continued to develop, it became clear that the foundation of their bond was not just fragile but completely fabricated. Both Montgomery and Jesse were hiding their true identities, spinning an intricate web of lies that only became more complex as their conversations deepened. For Thomas Montgomery, the deception was deliberate. He knew he was not the young, virile Marine he pretended to be. Yet, the more he communicated with Jesse, the more invested he became in maintaining the illusion. His real life, his wife, his daughters, his age all became distant memories when he sat down at his computer to speak with her. Every interaction allowed him to retreat further into his fantasy, where he was not a 47-year-old factory worker, but a 20-year-old war hero, adored by a beautiful young woman. This was no longer a casual escape for Montgomery. It had become an emotional lifeline, something that filled the void of his midlife crisis and gave him a sense of worth he had long been missing. But Montgomery wasn't the only one lying. Unbeknownst to him, Jessie was not the innocent 18-year-old high school senior she claimed to be. Behind the photos of a blonde teenager was Mary Sheeler, Jessie's mother, a middle-aged woman pretending to be her daughter in the very same chat rooms where Montgomery roamed. Mary was manipulating the conversation with a deceit that rivaled Montgomery's, feeding his delusions while hiding her own motivations. Whether her actions were driven by boredom, loneliness, or a need for attention, Mary was just as deeply entrenched in the fiction they had created together. As their exchanges intensified, so did the emotional connection between them. Jessie showered Montgomery with compliments, called him her hero, and expressed feelings of love and admiration. She sent flirtatious messages, creating a fantasy world where they could both escape their reality. For Montgomery, this attention was intoxicating, and it wasn't long before he was sharing increasingly personal details about his life as Marine Sniper. He confided in Jesse about his supposed military experiences, his desires, and his dreams for the future, all while knowing that none of it was true. The more they talked, the more Montgomery became obsessed with the idea of Jessie, the girl who, in his mind, adored him unconditionally. His need to sustain this fantasy grew stronger, and he started to make bold claims about their future together. He would leave his wife, he promised. They would meet one day, and everything would fall into place. He was fully immersed in the lie, blinded by his desire to hold onto something that gave his life meaning. But beneath the surface of these digital interactions, there was an underlying tension. The deeper their deceptions grew, the harder it became to control the narrative. The lies that had once brought them together were now leading them down a dark, irreversible path, one where reality would soon come crashing in with deadly consequences. While Thomas Montgomery was living out his fantasy online as Marine Sniper, the real world around him, his family, his home, his responsibilities began to unravel. At home, he was Thomas, a 47-year-old husband to Cindy, a woman who had been by his side for nearly 2 decades, and father to two daughters who had grown up relying on him. But in recent months, the man they knew had begun to change in ways that were both confusing and deeply troubling. Cindy Montgomery had once known her husband as a hardworking, dependable man, quiet but present. He had always been the type to come home from his shift at the factory, settle in front of the television, and repeat the same routine day after day. It wasn't a life filled with excitement, but it was one of stability. Yet, the moment Montgomery began his online affair with Jesse, that stability started to crack. Cindy noticed the changes almost immediately. Montgomery spent more and more time glued to his computer, disappearing into the basement for hours on end, often late into the night. His previously distant but steady presence was now completely replaced by an eerie detachment. Conversations became shorter, and his temper seemed quicker to flare. He grew secretive, constantly minimizing windows when she walked by or snapping at her for even the smallest interruptions. She couldn't pinpoint exactly what was going on, but she knew that something was deeply wrong. His relationship with his daughters, too, began to suffer. Where he once tried to be a father who participated in their lives, that effort faded. Montgomery was distracted, preoccupied with his online world. The cheerful laughter and father daughter bonding moments that once filled their home were replaced by an awkward distance. His daughters, sensing the change in him, withdrew, unsure of what had caused the sudden shift in their father's behavior. At first, Montgomery believed he could keep his two lives separate. He thought he could be the devoted family man during the day and the young, virile Marine Sniper by night. But the more time he spent in his fantasy world with Jesse, the more he struggled to reconcile the reality he lived in. He found himself drifting away from the family that had once defined him. The lies were piling up, and managing both identities became a burden too heavy to bear. His obsession with Jesse consumed him. Conversations with his wife became a source of irritation, and his children were no longer a priority. Every part of his real life felt dull and lifeless compared to the excitement he experienced in his online chats. Montgomery's family could sense the growing distance, but they had no idea just how far he had already drifted into a web of deceit so thick that it would soon threaten everything they held dear. As his double life continued, the tension mounted. The lies were not just reserved for Jesse anymore, they seeped into his home, into his interactions with his wife and children. Montgomery was trying to maintain the illusion, but the cracks in his facade were widening. And soon enough, the truth would be impossible to hide. Thomas Montgomery didn't just create a fictional persona in Marine Sniper, he completely reinvented himself as Tommy, a younger, idealized version of the man he wished he could be. Tommy was the opposite of everything Montgomery felt trapped by in his real life. He was 20, full of vitality, confidence, and physical prowess, a Marine who had seen battle, who commanded respect and admiration. In contrast, Montgomery felt worn down by the routine of his factory job, his aging body, and the humdrum existence of a suburban middle-aged man. This transformation into Tommy was not just a surface-level fantasy. It became central to Montgomery's identity in his online world. Every interaction with Jesse fed into this constructed reality. As Tommy, he could experience the youth and excitement that had long slipped away from him. He relished the chance to play the role of the young, strong Marine who had captured the heart of an 18-year-old girl. In many ways, Tommy was everything Montgomery believed he could never be in real life: invincible, heroic, and desired. Psychologically, Tommy represented Montgomery's deep yearning to escape the constraints of his own life. The fantasy of being Tommy allowed him to retreat from the feelings of inadequacy and insignificance that had plagued him for years. In his mind, this was more than just an online persona. It was a way to reclaim the youth and virility he felt he had lost. It was a form of wish fulfillment, one where he could shed the weight of responsibility, age, and reality itself. For a man facing a midlife crisis, the appeal of Tommy was irresistible. As the conversations between Tommy and Jesse grew more intimate, the line between fantasy and reality blurred even further for Montgomery. He wasn't just playing a part anymore, he was emotionally invested in the life he had created. Tommy wasn't just a mask he wore, it became his way of living through a dream that felt more real to him than his actual life. The more Montgomery embraced his alter ego, the harder it became for him to separate the lie from the truth. In the online world, Tommy was everything Montgomery wanted to be. He was adored by Jessie, who called him her hero and admired his bravery as a Marine. For Montgomery, these affirmations were addictive. They fed into the illusion that he could live a life full of passion and excitement, a life that was free from the drudgery of his real world responsibilities. His relationship with Jesse hinged entirely on the existence of Tommy. Without Tommy, there would be no romance, no excitement, and no escape. But with every passing day, Tommy became more difficult to maintain. The cracks in the fantasy started to show as Montgomery's real life continued to demand his attention. He couldn't sustain the lie forever, but the allure of being Tommy, of being someone younger, stronger, and more desirable was too powerful to let go. Montgomery was sinking deeper into the illusion, not realizing that the deeper he went, the closer he came to a breaking point. The psychological toll of living as Tommy was enormous. Montgomery's grip on reality was loosening as he became more consumed by his alter ego. This was no longer a harmless escape, it had become an obsession. And in his desperation to hold on to Tommy, Montgomery would soon make choices that would lead him down a deadly path, one where fantasy and reality would collide with tragic consequences. As Thomas Montgomery immersed himself deeper into his fantasy life as Tommy, there was a disturbing twist lurking beneath the surface of his relationship with Jessie, a twist that neither he nor anyone else could have anticipated. Jessie, the girl Montgomery believed to be an innocent and flirtatious 18-year-old high school senior, was not who she seemed. In reality, the person behind the screen wasn't a teenager at all. It was Mary Sheeler, Jessie's mother, a middle-aged woman who was orchestrating the entire deception. Mary Sheeler had used her daughter's identity to enter the chat rooms, sending Montgomery photos of the real Jessie, blonde, youthful, and vibrant, while pretending to be the girl herself. The real Jessie, unaware of her mother's actions, had no part in the disturbing drama unfolding online. It was Mary who had engaged Montgomery in flirtatious and emotionally charged conversations, creating a fictional relationship that was as compelling to her as it was to Montgomery. The implications of this new layer of deceit were profound. Mary's manipulation added another complex and twisted dimension to the story. Her motives were not entirely clear. Was she driven by boredom, loneliness, or some deeper psychological need for attention and control? Whatever the reason, Mary had used her daughter's image to craft an elaborate lie, one that not only ensnared Montgomery but also fueled his delusions about Tommy and Jessie. In a way, both Mary and Montgomery were living through their own fantasies, both desperate to escape the realities of their mundane lives. For Montgomery, the revelation of this deception would have been devastating had he known. He believed he had captured the heart of a beautiful young woman who adored him, and his entire emotional investment hinged on that belief. The discovery that Jessie was not only an illusion, but the creation of a woman closer to his own age, would have shattered the fantasy world he had clung to so tightly. What made Mary's deception even more chilling was the fact that she continued to feed Montgomery's obsession, even as it spiraled toward violence. She flirted, teased, and maintained the ruse, all while knowing the truth of her actions. Her role in the unfolding tragedy was as significant as Montgomery's, yet she never faced the same consequences for her deceit. It was a game for Mary, a way to fill the void in her own life by living vicariously through the identity of her daughter. The psychological impact of Mary's actions cannot be understated. By posing as Jesse, she manipulated not only Montgomery's emotions but also his perception of reality. Her lies fueled the fire of his obsession, blurring the lines between truth and fiction until Montgomery was completely lost in the web of deceit. He wasn't just deceiving others anymore, he was deceiving himself, believing that his relationship with Jesse was real and tangible. This added layer of betrayal set the stage for the catastrophic events that were about to unfold. With each message, each photo, and each interaction, the stakes were rising. The fragile fantasy Montgomery had constructed around Jesse was bound to collapse, but when it did, it would lead to a tragedy that no one could have predicted. The revelation that Jesse was actually Mary Sheeler was just the beginning of the unraveling, and when the truth finally emerged, the fallout would be deadly. As the web of deceit between Tommy and Jesse continued to grow, the dynamics of their relationship took a sudden and dangerous turn. The moment Jessie began to shift her attention away from Thomas Montgomery and towards another man, Brian Barrett, a 22-year-old co-worker of Montgomery, the fragile fantasy that Montgomery had been clinging to began to unravel. Brian Barrett was everything Montgomery, in his midlife crisis, wished he could be. He was young, charismatic, and real qualities that sharply contrasted with the fictional Tommy that Montgomery had so carefully crafted. Unlike Montgomery's alter ego, Brian existed in the real world and was someone Jesse, or more accurately, Mary Sheeler pretending to be Jesse, could actually interact with. This sudden shift in Jesse's affection left Montgomery feeling sidelined, humiliated, and dangerously insecure. As Jesse began to engage more with Brian online, Montgomery's jealousy ignited into a consuming rage. He had spent months building a fantasy where he was the center of Jesse's world, her hero and protector. Now, in his mind, this much younger, more desirable man was threatening everything he had built. The flirtatious conversations between Jesse and Brian, which Montgomery witnessed in the same chat room, began to fuel his paranoia. He read every comment, every playful exchange between them with growing anger, feeling as though Brian was stealing the affection that had once been his. What made matters worse for Montgomery was that he and Brian worked at the same factory, making the situation not just an online rivalry, but one that spilled into the real world. Each day, Montgomery would see Brian, a living reminder of the youth and potential that he felt had long slipped away from him. Brian was a tangible threat to the fantasy Montgomery had constructed, not just in his mind, but in his daily life. The love triangle that emerged between Tommy, Jesse, and Brian was built on lies, but the emotions it stirred in Montgomery were all too real. His jealousy and obsession with Jesse quickly became toxic, blinding him to reason. In his mind, Brian wasn't just another man flirting online, he was a rival, someone who could take away the only source of joy Montgomery had left. And worse, Brian was real, while Tommy was not. The more attention Jesse gave to Brian, the more Montgomery's behavior shifted from jealousy to outright obsession. He began sending increasingly aggressive and desperate messages to Jesse, trying to win back her affection, to prove that he was the man she should be with, not Brian. His insecurity, compounded by the knowledge that his entire relationship with Jesse was built on lies, pushed him into darker emotional territory. But Jessie, or rather Mary, seemed to relish the attention she was receiving from both men. She continued to play them off one another, using their growing rivalry to fuel her own twisted game. As Montgomery's jealousy deepened, so did the intensity of his feelings for Jessie. He wasn't just pretending to be Tommy anymore, he was losing himself completely in the identity, desperate to hold onto the affection that Jessie had once shown him. This love triangle, fueled by deception, was teetering on the edge of disaster. Montgomery's feelings of betrayal and inadequacy were intensifying by the day, and his anger towards Brian, his real world rival, was simmering dangerously. What had once been a game of online flirtation was now becoming a deadly competition, one where Montgomery's jealousy, rage, and obsession would push him to the point of no return. With each passing day, Thomas Montgomery's jealousy and rage escalated into a full blown obsession. What had started as a thrilling escape from his dull, middle aged life had now consumed him entirely. The shift in Jesse's attention toward Brian Barrett wasn't just a blow to Montgomery's ego, it was a devastating rejection that shattered the fantasy world he had worked so hard to maintain. And Montgomery, already living a lie, wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers without a fight. His fixation on Jessie grew darker and more intense as he watched her conversations with Brian unfold. Though Jessie, or Mary Sheeler, posing as her daughter wasn't real in the way Montgomery believed, the emotional investment he had placed in their relationship was painfully genuine. In his mind, he had built a bond with her that transcended the boundaries of age, distance, and reality itself. So when Jessie started turning her attention toward the younger, more real Brian, Montgomery's fragile psyche began to crack under the pressure. Every time Jesse flirted with Brian in the chat room, Montgomery's anger deepened. He became consumed by thoughts of the two of them together, imagining conversations, private messages, and romantic exchanges. The fact that he and Brian worked in the same factory made it even worse. It wasn't just a faceless stranger taking Jesse away from him, it was someone he saw every day, someone he had to endure in his real life. Brian's presence gnawed at him, representing everything Montgomery couldn't be: young, attractive, and above all, a real person in Jesse's world. Montgomery began stalking the chat room obsessively, tracking every word exchanged between Jesse and Brian. His messages to Jesse became more desperate, pleading for her to come back to him, to choose him over Brian. He filled their conversations with increasingly possessive language, trying to reassert control over the situation. His jealousy had transformed into a dangerous obsession, and it was no longer just about Jesse. Brian had become the focus of Montgomery's growing hatred. This obsession wasn't limited to the digital world. Montgomery's fixation on Brian began bleeding into his everyday life. He watched Brian at work, resenting every word, every gesture, every casual interaction he had with their co-workers. In Montgomery's mind, Brian wasn't just a rival for Jesse's affection. He was a living embodiment of everything Montgomery hated about himself. Brian was the younger, better version of who Montgomery pretended to be as Tommy, and every reminder of that reality fueled Montgomery's growing rage. At home, Montgomery's behavior became even more erratic. He was distracted, angry, and emotionally volatile, his wife and daughters noticing the increasingly unstable man he had become. But they had no idea of the depth of his obsession. To them, he was simply withdrawing, becoming more distant and irritable. They couldn't see the storm that was brewing inside him, a storm that was inching closer to violence with each passing day. Montgomery's obsession with Brian and Jesse pushed him further into isolation. The boundaries between his real life and his fantasy world dissolved. He began plotting ways to eliminate Brian, convinced that getting rid of his rival was the only way to win Jesse's love back. His thoughts darkened, and his conversations with Jesse became more erratic, filled with veiled threats and desperate promises. In his mind, Montgomery was fighting for the love of his life, but in reality, he was being driven by a toxic mix of insecurity, jealousy, and obsession. The lies he had built his fantasy on were starting to unravel, and Montgomery was losing control. As his fixation on Brian intensified, so did his willingness to cross a line that would change everything. His obsession wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. And soon that obsession would culminate in an irreversible act of violence. Cindy Montgomery had long sensed that something was wrong with her husband. His late nights spent at the computer, his sudden irritability, and the emotional distance that had crept into their marriage were undeniable. But what she discovered one fateful day would shatter any illusions she had about the man she had spent nearly 2 decades with. The discovery came when Cindy, suspecting something unusual, decided to investigate the mysterious shift in Thomas's behavior. She had grown tired of the late-night whispers she heard from the basement, the constant presence of her husband at the computer, and his guarded, secretive demeanor. Determined to find out the truth, Cindy found herself drawn to a box of old letters tucked away in the basement, a box that Thomas had been unusually protective of in recent weeks. Inside the box were printed copies of the online exchanges between Marine Sniper Thomas's alter ego and Jesse. What Cindy found in those messages was far worse than she had imagined. As she read through the explicit, flirtatious conversations between her husband and the girl he believed to be an 18-year-old high school senior, Cindy's world collapsed. The husband she thought she knew had not only been engaging in an affair, but had been living a lie, pretending to be a much younger man and exchanging romantic, even sexual, messages with a girl half their daughter's age. Her first reaction was shock, disbelief. This wasn't the Thomas she knew. But as the shock wore off, it quickly gave way to fury. The betrayal was twofold. Not only had Thomas been unfaithful in an emotional and virtual sense, but he had created an entirely false identity to live out his fantasy. The husband she thought she could trust had been leading a double life, hiding behind a persona that was a far cry from the man she had married. Cindy was not the kind of woman to remain passive in the face of such a revelation. Rather than confronting Thomas immediately, she took a bold step. She knew that exposing his lies wouldn't just affect their marriage, it would unravel the entire online world he had built with Jesse armed with the printed exchanges. Cindy made the decision to confront the other person involved in the deceit. She reached out to Jesse, determined to bring the truth to light. In a letter sent directly to Jesse's address, Cindy revealed the truth about Thomas's real identity, his age, his marriage, his children, and the fact that the man Jesse had been speaking to was not Tommy, the young Marine sniper, but a middle-aged factory worker in his late 40s. This act of exposure set off a chain reaction that would escalate tensions in Thomas's life to a breaking point. When Jessie, or rather Mary Sheila, received Cindy's letter, it shattered the illusion that Montgomery had worked so hard to maintain. The carefully constructed world of Tommy was crumbling, and Jessie's reaction would prove to be a turning point in the deadly game they were playing. For Thomas, Cindy's discovery and her subsequent actions marked the beginning of the end. His secret life had been exposed, not just to his wife, but to the girl he had become so obsessed with. The fantasy that had kept him going, the one place where he felt admired and wanted, was now slipping out of his control, and with it came the unraveling of his already fragile mental state. Cindy's discovery did more than reveal the truth, it amplified the pressure building inside Thomas. His lies were no longer just a personal escape, they had real-world consequences that were now spiraling beyond his grasp. The tension in his marriage, the rage he felt toward Brian Barrett, and the realization that his online world was disintegrating all collided in his mind, pushing him toward a breaking point. This pivotal moment where Cindy exposed his secret didn't just destroy the Montgomery household, it set into motion the final tragic series of events that would lead to an irreversible act of violence. As the walls of his fantasy world came crashing down, Thomas Montgomery was left clinging to the only thing he had left, his anger, and that anger would soon turn lethal. The moment Cindy Montgomery took matters into her own hands by writing a letter to Jesse, the illusion that had sustained Thomas Montgomery's double life began to crumble. In that letter, Cindy revealed the full truth about her husband, laying bare his real identity, a middle-aged, married father far removed from the 20-year-old Marine sniper he had pretended to be. This simple act of exposure wasn't just a blow to her husband's fantasy. It was a carefully aimed strike that shook the entire foundation of his relationship with Jesse. Cindy's letter was straightforward, but its impact was devastating. In her calm but firm words, she informed Jesse, who, unbeknownst to Cindy, was actually Mary Sheeler, that Thomas was not the young, heroic Marine she had been talking to. He was a 47-year-old man with two daughters and a wife who had discovered the deceit. She provided details of their family life, their years of marriage, and the truth about his mundane job in a factory. There was no longer any room for the fantasy that Thomas had crafted so carefully. The truth was out in the open, and Cindy ensured that Jesse would know everything. For Mary Sheeler, playing the part of Jessie, the letter was a bombshell. Up until this point, she had manipulated the relationship with Thomas, pretending to be her teenage daughter and enjoying the attention and control she had over him. But Cindy's revelation meant that she could no longer maintain the fantasy with Tommy. The reality that Montgomery was much older, married, and lying all along made it impossible to continue with the charade without consequences. The impact of this letter was immediate. Montgomery's online relationship with Jesse was now exposed for the lie it was. The fantasy that had kept both of them invested in their digital romance was shattered. Jesse, or rather Mary, had used her daughter's photos to lure Montgomery into the relationship, but with the truth now exposed, her own deception was no longer a secret. Though she wasn't ready to abandon the game just yet, the dynamic between them had shifted dramatically. For Montgomery, the letter was devastating. He hadn't known Cindy had written to Jesse until the fallout began. Suddenly, the attention, admiration, and affection he had been receiving from Jesse faded. The conversations that had once been filled with flirtation and romantic fantasy were now laced with tension. Jesse began to pull away, and Montgomery felt the ground slip beneath him. The lie he had so carefully built was crumbling, and he was powerless to stop it. The letter brought everything to a head. Montgomery's obsession with Jesse had already been spiraling out of control, but now, with his secret exposed, he became desperate. He flooded Jesse with messages, begging her to overlook the lies, to continue their relationship, to see him as more than just the man Cindy had described. But Jesse, or Mary, wasn't responding the way she used to. The affection was gone, and Montgomery could feel the distance growing. He was no longer the young, desirable Marine sniper in her eyes. He was Thomas Montgomery, a middle-aged man whose lies had finally caught up with him. The exposure of the lie also intensified Montgomery's jealousy of Brian Barrett. With Jessie now turning her attention even more toward Brian, Montgomery's desperation grew. He saw Brian as the final nail in the coffin of his fantasy life. Brian, the younger, real man, was now everything Montgomery wanted to be but couldn't, and Cindy's letter had forced Montgomery to confront a truth he wasn't ready to face. His fantasy was over. As the days passed, the tension within Montgomery built to a boiling point. The letter had ripped away his escape, leaving him with nothing but his failing marriage, a dead-end job, and a sense of utter humiliation. Cindy's decision to expose the truth had not only unraveled the relationship with Jesse, but it had also triggered the next phase of Montgomery's dangerous obsession. He wasn't just losing Jesse, he was losing control. And with that loss came a rising anger, one that would soon push him over the edge.
The letter was a turning point. It forced everyone involved to confront the reality of the situation. And for Montgomery, whose world was built on deception, this reality was unbearable. His obsession with Jesse, his hatred for Brian, and his deteriorating sense of self were now colliding, and the consequences would be tragic.
After Cindy Montgomery's devastating letter revealed the truth about her husband's age, marital status, and lies, the dynamic between Jesse and Thomas Montgomery changed drastically. No longer able to maintain the illusion of Tommy, Montgomery found himself losing the one thing that had kept him grounded in his crumbling fantasy, Jesse's affection. The once flirtatious and romantic exchanges between them grew cold, distant, and it wasn't long before Jessie, or more accurately, Mary Sheeler, shifted her attention elsewhere, toward a younger and more real prospect, Brian Barrett. Brian Barrett, Montgomery's 22-year-old co-worker, had slowly become a regular in the same online chat rooms where Montgomery had been living out his fantasy. Unlike Montgomery's fabricated identity, Brian was genuine, young, carefree, and easygoing, with the kind of charm that naturally attracted attention, including Jesse's. As the relationship between Jesse and Montgomery frayed, Jessie began to openly flirt with Brian, directing her affections toward him in ways that only deepened Montgomery's insecurities. For Thomas, this shift was more than just an annoyance, it was a personal attack. The affection and validation he had once received from Jessie had been the lifeline pulling him through the disillusionment of his real life. Now, seeing Jessie direct her playful, teasing messages toward Brian, Montgomery felt a profound sense of rejection and loss. Worse, he had to witness it every day, not just online, but at work, where Brian's presence became a living reminder of everything Montgomery wished he could be but wasn't. The online exchanges between Jesse and Brian played out in the same chat rooms that Montgomery had once dominated as Marine Sniper, but now those chat rooms were filled with inside jokes and flirtatious banter between Brian and Jesse, leaving Montgomery increasingly sidelined. Jessie started complimenting Brian in ways that mirrored the praise she had once showered on Tommy. She called Brian her stud and openly hinted at her growing interest in him, driving a wedge deeper into Montgomery's psyche. Montgomery's resentment and jealousy festered as he watched Brian take his place in Jesse's world. The jealousy that had once been an undercurrent of his relationship with Jesse now turned into full-blown rage. For Montgomery, it wasn't just about losing Jesse. It was about losing his identity, the fantasy he had constructed around himself as Tommy. In Brian, Montgomery saw everything he despised: youth, desirability, and most of all, reality. At this point, Montgomery's anger became all consuming. His obsession with Brian and Jesse began to dominate his thoughts. The chat room conversations that once brought him excitement now filled him with bitterness and hate. Montgomery could no longer stand to watch the relationship between Jesse and Brian flourish, especially knowing that Jesse had rejected him for someone younger and more appealing. His messages became increasingly hostile and erratic, filled with anger and desperation as he tried to regain control of a situation that was rapidly slipping away. This was the moment when Montgomery's anger turned deadly. His resentment toward Brian Barrett, already fueled by jealousy, now reached a tipping point. Montgomery was no longer content to watch from the sidelines as Brian and Jesse flirted in the chat rooms. He began to focus on Brian as the root of his pain and humiliation, fixating on the idea that eliminating his rival would somehow restore the life he had lost. In his mind, Brian was no longer just competition, he was an obstacle that needed to be removed. As Jesse lavished more attention on Brian, Montgomery's emotions spiraled further out of control. His fixation on Brian became a dangerous obsession, driving him to increasingly dark and violent thoughts. He couldn't bear the idea of Brian taking the place that Tommy had once held in Jesse's life. The more Jessie distanced herself from Montgomery, the more he felt backed into a corner. His fantasy world had collapsed, his lies were exposed, and now, with Jesse firmly in Brian's corner, Montgomery was left with nothing but his rage. It was in this moment of desperation and fury that Montgomery made the decision that would change everything. His jealousy and resentment, now boiling over, were about to explode in the most tragic and irreversible way possible. And Brian Barrett, unknowingly caught in the middle of this deadly triangle, would soon pay the ultimate price for Montgomery's obsession. As the relationship between Jesse and Brian Barrett blossomed, Thomas Montgomery found himself increasingly pushed to the edge. What had once been playful flirtation between him and Jesse had now become hostile and combative, as the trio's online conversations grew more tense and filled with resentment. The once anonymous chat room, which had served as Montgomery's escape from reality, now felt like a battlefield where he was losing ground every day. The final exchanges between Montgomery, Jesse, and Brian were toxic, laden with jealousy, bitterness, and anger. Jesse, still Mary Sheeler in disguise, egged on both men, enjoying the attention and control she had over them. Her flirtations with Brian became more overt as she teased Montgomery, knowing exactly how to provoke him. She would often compare Brian favorably to Tommy, highlighting Brian's youth and charm in ways that only deepened Montgomery's feelings of inadequacy. In these conversations, Brian played along, at times taunting Montgomery in return. He knew Montgomery was deeply jealous, and perhaps he didn't take the older man's anger seriously, viewing the situation as nothing more than a strange online rivalry. But to Montgomery, it was anything but harmless. The competition between him and Brian had escalated far beyond what Brian or Jesse could have imagined. Montgomery wasn't just jealous, he was consumed by it. And with each passing message, his anger turned more dangerous. Montgomery's messages to Jesse became increasingly erratic and aggressive. He began lashing out, making veiled threats, and expressing his frustration over being pushed aside for someone younger. In some of his final conversations, Montgomery's desperation was palpable. He pleaded with Jesse to give him another chance, to see past Brian and return to the relationship they had once shared. But Jesse remained indifferent, continuing to favor Brian, and this only stoked the flames of Montgomery's growing rage. In one particularly heated exchange, Montgomery's anger boiled over. He lashed out not only at Brian, but at Jessie, accusing her of playing with his emotions and manipulating him. He hinted at violence, though at the time neither Brian nor Jessie seemed to take these threats seriously. To them, it was all part of the strange and dramatic back and forth of their online interactions. But for Montgomery, these were not just empty words. His fantasy world had crumbled, and all that remained was his bitterness toward the younger man who had taken his place. The jealousy and tension in these final exchanges became unbearable for Montgomery. He couldn't stand watching Brian and Jesse flaunt their relationship in front of him, knowing that his alter ego Tommy had been discarded. Every message between Jesse and Brian was a reminder of his failure, his age, and the lies that had led him to this point. As their conversations continued, Montgomery's thoughts grew darker. He began contemplating the only solution he believed could restore his lost sense of control: eliminating Brian. Montgomery's descent into violent fantasies was gradual but clear. He fantasized about revenge, about erasing the man who had humiliated him and reclaiming the attention that Jesse had once lavished on him. The idea of harming Brian gave him a twisted sense of empowerment, as if by removing Brian from the equation, he could somehow restore the fantasy that had once brought him so much comfort. The online confrontations had pushed him to his breaking point, and Montgomery was ready to act on his darkest impulses. What neither Jesse nor Brian realized was that Montgomery's threats were not just empty words. His anger had festered for too long, and the final confrontations online were the catalyst that transformed his jealousy into a deadly resolve. Montgomery had made up his mind. If he couldn't have Jesse, then no one could, especially not Brian. The online love triangle had spiraled into something far more sinister, and it was only a matter of time before Montgomery's obsession would culminate in tragedy. The chat rooms, once a place of escape, had become the stage for Montgomery's unraveling. His final exchanges with Jesse and Brian were no longer about love, affection, or even competition. They were the last sparks before the explosion of violence that would soon follow. Montgomery's jealousy had morphed into a deadly determination, and soon the fantasy he had lived in for so long would be shattered by the harshest reality of all: murder. September 15th, 2006 marked the day when Thomas Montgomery's obsession with Brian Barrett reached its deadly climax. After weeks of escalating jealousy, Montgomery had finally crossed the threshold from fantasy into violent reality. His online rivalry with Brian, inflamed by Jesse's Mary Sheeler's manipulations, had consumed him entirely. His once quiet life as a middle aged factory worker had been overtaken by a single, all consuming goal: eliminating the man who had taken Jesse away from him. The tension had been building for weeks. Montgomery's erratic behavior at the factory where both he and Brian worked had not gone unnoticed. Co-workers had seen the odd exchanges between the two men, but no one could have predicted how far Montgomery would go to resolve the rivalry. Inside his mind, the lines between his online world as Tommy and his real-life identity had blurred to the point of no return. Montgomery was no longer thinking rationally. His anger had become his compass and his jealousy his only guide. On that fateful Friday, Montgomery put his plan into motion. Brian Barrett had no idea that the older man he worked alongside was harboring such intense hatred toward him. To Brian, Montgomery was simply a strange co-worker who had grown bitter over some online drama. The idea that Montgomery would take it beyond their shared chat room never crossed his mind. But Montgomery was no longer playing games. His plan was simple and brutal. He would catch Brian off guard when he least expected it. That afternoon, Montgomery knew Brian would be finishing his shift at the factory. He waited patiently for his moment, lurking in the parking lot as his younger rival prepared to leave work. Montgomery had brought a high-powered rifle with him, a chilling reminder that the man who had once claimed to be a Marine sniper online had now armed himself for real. The weapon, loaded and ready, was his answer to the rage that had been festering inside him for months. Brian, oblivious to the danger, walked out of the factory and toward his truck, likely thinking about nothing more than his plans for the weekend. It was at this vulnerable moment that Montgomery made his move. From a concealed position, Montgomery aimed the rifle at Brian and, without hesitation, fired 3 shots. Each bullet struck Brian, the young man collapsing onto the pavement in the parking lot. The attack was swift and fatal, leaving Brian with no chance to defend himself or even comprehend what was happening. The parking lot, once a mundane part of their daily lives, was now a crime scene. Brian's blood stained the concrete, his life snuffed out by a man driven to murder by jealousy and delusion. Montgomery, after pulling the trigger, fled the scene, leaving behind the body of his rival and a community in shock. News of the shooting spread quickly through the factory and the local community. Co-workers were horrified to learn that the man who had worked beside them had been gunned down in cold blood. No one could make sense of it. Brian had been young, kind, and well-liked. Why would anyone want to kill him? But for those who knew the depth of Montgomery's online obsession, the pieces began to fall into place. Montgomery's plan had been chillingly calculated. He had chosen the time and place with precision, knowing that Brian would be alone and unprotected as he left work. The factory parking lot, a place where they had both spent so much time, was the stage Montgomery had selected for his act of violence. There were no confrontations, no warnings, just cold, premeditated murder. Brian Barrett's life ended in an instant, and with it, the twisted love triangle that had consumed Montgomery came crashing down. The fantasy Montgomery had lived in, where he could win back Jesse by eliminating his competition, had now turned into a grim reality. But what Montgomery failed to realize was that his actions would not restore the world he had created online. In fact, they would only lead to more destruction, this time of his own life. As the day unfolded, investigators and police quickly arrived at the scene, and it didn't take long for suspicions to turn toward Montgomery. Co-workers recalled the tension between him and Brian, and Montgomery's erratic behavior in recent weeks made him an obvious suspect. The man who had once crafted an identity of a fearless Marine sniper had now become a real-life killer, and the consequences of his actions were about to catch up with him. The events of September 15th, 2006 were a turning point in the internet chat room murder case, marking the moment when Montgomery's obsession turned fatal. Brian Barrett, the innocent target of Montgomery's jealousy, had paid the ultimate price in a crime driven by delusion, fantasy, and a love triangle that existed only in the darkest corners of the internet. On September 15th, 2006, the twisted love triangle that had been playing out online between Thomas Montgomery, Jesse, and Brian Barrett culminated in a brutal and premeditated act of violence. Brian Barrett, unaware of the deadly obsession that had been festering in Montgomery's mind, was simply finishing his shift at the factory that day. What he didn't know was that Montgomery had been plotting to end his life, driven by jealousy and a delusional belief that removing Brian from the equation would somehow bring Jesse and the fantasy Montgomery had lived in for months back to him. That afternoon, as Brian walked to his truck in the parking lot after work, Montgomery lay in wait. He had positioned himself carefully, armed with a high-powered rifle he had brought to the factory, intending to ambush his young rival. From a concealed location, Montgomery watched as Brian approached his vehicle, completely unaware that he was being targeted. Without warning or confrontation, Montgomery took aim and fired. The first shot struck Brian in the chest, dropping him instantly. But Montgomery wasn't finished. He fired two more shots, each one hitting Brian as he lay on the ground, ensuring there was no chance of survival. The shots rang out in the otherwise quiet parking lot, but the attack happened so swiftly that no one was close enough to intervene or even realize what had occurred until it was too late. Montgomery's calm, deliberate approach to the murder was chilling, a calculated act meant to erase Brian from his life and from Jesse's. As Brian bled out on the cold pavement, his body riddled with bullets, Montgomery fled the scene. He left behind no note, no explanation, just the lifeless body of a 22-year-old man whose only crime was being caught in the crosshairs of Montgomery's obsession. The factory parking lot, a place of routine and normalcy, was now a crime scene marked by the blood of an innocent man. In the immediate aftermath, chaos spread through the factory as co-workers began to realize something terrible had happened. When Brian didn't return home, his friends and family grew concerned, and it wasn't long before his body was discovered. The shock of the murder hit the local community hard. Brian had been a well-liked, easygoing young man with a bright future ahead of him. His death seemed senseless and unimaginable until the truth behind Montgomery's motivations began to surface. Montgomery, knowing that the police would soon be looking for answers, made attempts to cover his tracks. He left the factory quickly, attempting to distance himself from the crime. In the days following the murder, he went about his routine as if nothing had happened, but his behavior raised suspicions almost immediately. Co-workers recalled the simmering tension between Montgomery and Brian and Montgomery's growing obsession with the online relationship he had been maintaining under the guise of Tommy. Despite his attempts to act normal, Montgomery's cover-up was doomed to fail. Investigators quickly zeroed in on him as a suspect, especially after learning about the bizarre love triangle that had been playing out online. The fact that Montgomery and Brian worked together, coupled with the known animosity between them over Jesse, made Montgomery an obvious person of interest. Moreover, the method of the attack, calculated and executed with precision, suggested someone who had planned the murder rather than an impulsive act of violence. In an effort to erase any digital evidence that might tie him to the crime, Montgomery deleted many of his online communications with Jesse and attempted to distance himself from the online world where his obsession had begun. But the damage was already done. The police, working with forensic experts, were able to recover key pieces of digital evidence, including chat logs and email exchanges that pointed directly to Montgomery's involvement in both the relationship with Jesse and the growing hostility toward Brian. In the days following the murder, as the investigation unfolded, it became clear to law enforcement that Montgomery's obsession had driven him to commit murder. His efforts to cover his tracks were ultimately futile, and the overwhelming weight of the evidence against him would soon lead to his arrest. The aftermath of Brian Barrett's murder was felt deeply by his family, friends, and the entire factory community. A young man with his whole life ahead of him had been brutally murdered not for any crime he had committed, but because he had been caught in the twisted fantasies of a man who could no longer distinguish between the real world and his own delusions. Montgomery's actions didn't just destroy one life, they shattered the lives of everyone connected to the case. For Montgomery, the murder of Brian Barrett marked the final unraveling of his life. The fantasy he had clung to so desperately was gone, replaced by the harsh reality of his own violent actions. And no matter how much he tried to cover his tracks, the truth was about to catch up with him. In the wake of Brian Barrett's brutal murder, the small, close knit community where both he and Thomas Montgomery lived and worked was left in a state of shock and disbelief. The horrifying reality of what had transpired in the factory parking lot on September 15th spread quickly, and with it, the chilling realization that the man responsible for the crime was someone they had all known. Thomas Montgomery, the mild mannered, quiet factory worker who had been a fixture in the community for years, was now exposed as a cold blooded killer. For those who had worked alongside Montgomery and Bryan, the shock was particularly acute. Montgomery had always been considered somewhat of a loner, but no one had ever seen him as dangerous. He was just another middle aged man trying to make ends meet, a steady worker who had spent years at the factory, keeping mostly to himself. The idea that this seemingly ordinary man had harbored such deep resentment, jealousy, and violent tendencies was almost impossible to comprehend. Brian Barrett, on the other hand, was well liked by his co workers. At just 22, he was seen as friendly, approachable, and easygoing, a young man with his whole life ahead of him. His murder left many of his friends and family grappling with an overwhelming sense of loss. How could someone so young, so full of potential, be taken away in such a senseless act of violence? Brian's death felt like a cruel, random tragedy, one that defied explanation. The factory, which had been the backdrop for the murder, became a somber place in the days that followed. Workers gathered to exchange hushed conversations, struggling to make sense of what had happened. The parking lot, once a routine part of their daily lives, had now become a reminder of the horror that had unfolded. People who had known Montgomery for years found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about him. How had he hidden this side of himself for so long? What had driven him to commit such a monstrous act? Outside the factory, the local community was equally stunned. News of the murder spread quickly, and the details of the online love triangle that had triggered the crime began to surface. The bizarre and twisted nature of the case, Montgomery posing as a young Marine online, his obsession with Jesse, and the rivalry with Brian seemed almost too surreal to be true. It was the kind of story you would expect to see on a crime show or read about in a tabloid, not something that could happen in their own town. Yet it had, and the reality of that was unsettling. Brian's family, in particular, was devastated. They had lost a son, a brother, and a friend in the most unexpected and violent way imaginable. Their grief was compounded by the senselessness of the crime. Brian had done nothing to deserve the hatred that Montgomery had directed toward him. He had simply been caught in the crosshairs of a man whose mind had been warped by jealousy and fantasy. For Brian's family, the murder was a wound that would never fully heal. Meanwhile, those who had known Montgomery's family were left reeling from the revelations. Cindy Montgomery, Thomas's wife, and their daughters had to face the horrifying truth that the man they had lived with, the man they had shared their lives with, was now a murderer. Cindy's discovery of Thomas's online relationship had already shaken their marriage, but the fact that it had led to murder was something she could never have predicted. The Montgomery family, once considered just another suburban household, was now at the center of a tragic and incomprehensible crime. The ripple effects of Brian Barrett's murder extended far beyond just the families involved. The entire community was left grappling with a sense of fear and uncertainty. How could someone who seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable, be capable of such a cold blooded act of violence? The knowledge that a man like Thomas Montgomery had been living among them, harboring such dark and violent thoughts, left many people questioning their own safety. If Montgomery could snap in such a dramatic and deadly way, who else might be hiding dangerous secrets? The shock of the murder lingered for weeks as more details about Montgomery's double life and the online deception came to light. The twisted story of Jesse, the online love triangle, and the escalating jealousy and rage that had driven Montgomery to kill became the subject of endless discussion and speculation. People who had once seen Montgomery as nothing more than a quiet, unassuming man now viewed him through the lens of his crime, a man capable of murder driven by obsession and rage. For the community, life would eventually move on, but the memory of Brian Barrett's murder would remain a haunting reminder of the darkness that can sometimes hide behind even the most ordinary of faces. Montgomery's actions shattered the peace of the town, leaving behind scars that would not easily fade. The shock of the crime rippled outward, touching everyone who had known either man, leaving them with a chilling understanding of how little they truly knew about the people around them. As the shock of Brian Barrett's murder spread through the community, the police launched an immediate investigation into the killing. Detectives knew they were dealing with a premeditated crime. Brian had been shot multiple times in a cold, calculated manner in broad daylight in the factory parking lot. The question was, who would have done such a thing and why? From the very beginning, the investigation pointed to Thomas Montgomery as a likely suspect. Detectives quickly learned about the strange dynamics between Montgomery, Brian Barrett, and the mysterious Jesse thanks to interviews with their co-workers. Several of them recalled the simmering tension between Montgomery and Brian, a tension that had spilled over from their online rivalry and into the real world. What started as some harmless online flirtation had clearly escalated into something much darker, and the police wasted no time following that trail. The first major clue came from Brian Barrett's online activity. Detectives discovered that Barrett had been part of an online love triangle involving a woman named Jessie and an older man who had been masquerading as a young Marine sniper under the screen name Marine Sniper. As they dug deeper, it didn't take long for investigators to identify Marine Sniper as Thomas Montgomery. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Montgomery had not only been obsessively involved with Jessie, but had also seen Brian as his rival for her affections. But it wasn't just the online evidence that pointed to Montgomery. Physical evidence began to mount as well. Ballistics from the bullets recovered at the crime scene matched the rifle that detectives later found in Montgomery's possession. Witnesses from the factory reported seeing Montgomery behaving oddly around the time of the murder, including his sudden disappearance from the scene shortly after the shooting. His co-workers had also noticed his increasingly erratic behavior in the days leading up to the killing, further cementing him as a prime suspect. Montgomery's erratic online behavior also raised red flags. Despite his attempts to delete incriminating messages and cover his tracks, forensic investigators were able to recover much of his digital footprint. His obsessive, hostile exchanges with Jesse and, more importantly, his jealousy toward Brian painted a clear picture of a man whose emotions had spiraled out of control. The detectives traced chat logs, emails, and messages that documented Montgomery's growing rage, culminating in violent threats that foreshadowed the murder. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a series of conversations Montgomery had with Jesse in the weeks leading up to the murder, where he vented his frustration and rage toward Brian. In these messages, he had openly expressed his hatred for his younger rival, making thinly veiled threats about eliminating him from the picture. These messages, while not direct confessions, strongly suggested that Montgomery had been contemplating violence long before the day of the murder. As the investigation progressed, detectives continued to build their case, piecing together Montgomery's obsession with Jesse and the tragic rivalry that had consumed him. They interviewed Cindy Montgomery, who revealed that she had written the letter to Jesse exposing her husband's true identity and how this revelation had led to a significant shift in Montgomery's behavior. Cindy's testimony gave detectives further insight into the psychological collapse Montgomery had experienced, his fantasy life as Tommy unraveling, his jealousy toward Brian deepening, and his grip on reality slipping away. Detectives also focused on Montgomery's movements on the day of the murder. Witnesses placed him at the factory around the time of the shooting, and his sudden absence immediately after the shots were fired raised suspicion. Security camera footage from nearby buildings didn't capture the shooting itself, but it did show Montgomery leaving the area in a hurry shortly after the time of the murder. With mounting evidence, ballistics, witness testimony, and Montgomery's online communications, police had enough to make an arrest. Just days after Brian Barrett's murder, Thomas Montgomery was taken into custody. His arrest sent further shockwaves through the community. How could this seemingly unremarkable man, a husband and father, have been driven to such a cold-blooded act of violence? Montgomery initially denied involvement, claiming he had nothing to do with Brian's death, but the weight of the evidence against him was overwhelming. Detectives had carefully traced his path from jealous obsession to calculated murder, and the case they had built left little room for doubt. The investigation had revealed the full extent of Montgomery's obsession with Jesse and the dangerous lengths he had gone to in an attempt to reclaim control over a fantasy that had consumed his life. The swift and thorough investigation not only brought Montgomery to justice, but also exposed the dark side of internet anonymity and online deception. For months, Montgomery had lived in a fantasy world where he was Tommy, the young Marine, adored by Jesse. But in the real world, that fantasy had driven him to commit a senseless and tragic murder, one that shocked everyone who had once seen him as just another quiet man living an ordinary life. As investigators delved deeper into the murder of Brian Barrett, they began to uncover a labyrinth of online deception that had fueled Thomas Montgomery's deadly obsession. What started as a straightforward murder investigation quickly turned into something far more complex as detectives unraveled the layers of lies and manipulation that had been woven over months in the shadowy world of internet chat rooms. The first significant discovery came when detectives traced the online activity that connected Thomas Montgomery, Brian Barrett, and the mysterious Jesse Montgomery's online alias Marine Sniper had been central to the bizarre love triangle that had led to the crime. Investigators quickly realized that Montgomery had been masquerading as a much younger man, a 20-year-old Marine veteran, while engaging in a romantic and highly emotional relationship with Jesse, whom he believed to be an 18-year-old high school senior. But as they dug deeper into the identity of Jessie, detectives uncovered another shocking twist. Jessie was not who she claimed to be either. The teenage girl Montgomery and Brian had both been vying for online was, in fact, Mary Sheeler, a middle-aged woman posing as her daughter. Using her daughter's photos and pretending to be an innocent, flirtatious young girl, Mary had lured both Montgomery and Brian into a twisted web of online lies and manipulation.
For months, Mary Sheeler had maintained the charade, playing both men against each other while enjoying the attention and control she wielded over them. She had sent Montgomery and Brian photos of her real daughter, Jessie, a blonde, attractive teenager who had no idea her mother was using her image in such a disturbing way. Mary had woven an elaborate story, convincing Montgomery that he was building a meaningful connection with a much younger woman, when in reality, it was Mary who had been behind every flirtatious message, every teasing photo, every declaration of love.
The investigators were stunned by this revelation. The case had already been bizarre, with Montgomery creating a false identity as Tommy, a young Marine, but the discovery that Jessie was actually Mary Sheeler, an adult woman, added an even darker layer to the story. The investigators now realized that both Montgomery and Bryan had been pawns in Mary's cruel game of deception. Neither man had been corresponding with the girl they thought they were falling in love with. Instead, they had been manipulated by a woman old enough to be Montgomery's peer, not his love interest. The twisted nature of this online love triangle began to take shape as investigators pieced together the timeline of events. Mary had expertly played both men, stoking Montgomery's jealousy by shifting her affections toward Brian, all while maintaining the facade of Jesse. The more attention she gave to Brian, the more it drove Montgomery into a jealous rage, deepening his obsession and pushing him toward violence. Her actions, whether motivated by boredom, loneliness, or a need for control, had set in motion the tragic events that would lead to Brian's murder. Detectives reviewed the chat logs and emails between Jesse, Montgomery, and Brian, uncovering the full extent of the manipulation. In some conversations, Jessie had poured affection on Montgomery, calling him her hero and fueling his delusion that he was someone important and desirable. But when Mary grew bored with him, or when the tension between the two men intensified, she shifted her attention to Brian, playing the younger, real man against the older, fictional one. She reveled in the attention, enjoying the rivalry that had erupted between the two men over her. The revelation of Mary Sheeler's deception left both the investigators and the public stunned. Not only had Montgomery created a false identity, but the woman he was obsessed with had been lying all along. The real Jessie, Mary's daughter, had no idea she had been at the center of such a deadly love triangle. In using her daughter's image, Mary had not only deceived two men, but also put her own family in the middle of a dangerous and deadly game. For Thomas Montgomery, the discovery of Jesse's true identity would be shattering. The woman he had built his entire fantasy around, the young girl he believed loved him, was nothing more than a figment of someone else's imagination. In reality, he had been manipulated by a woman his own age, a woman who had no romantic interest in him, only a sick fascination with playing out her fantasies in the anonymity of the internet. The layers of deception uncovered by investigators painted a chilling picture of how internet anonymity and false identities can lead to tragic consequences. Both Montgomery and Brian had been deceived by Mary's lies, but while Brian had unwittingly found himself in the crosshairs of Montgomery's jealousy, Montgomery had been driven to murder by an illusion. In the end, the fantasy world they had all been living in came crashing down, revealing the stark, disturbing reality underneath. The case served as a sobering reminder of the dangers of online relationships, where identities can be fabricated and manipulated with devastating consequences. For Montgomery, the revelation of Mary's deceit would be part of his undoing, and for Brian, it had already cost him his life. Following the swift and thorough investigation, the evidence against Thomas Montgomery was overwhelming. Detectives, armed with a clear understanding of the motive and a mountain of digital and physical evidence, closed in on Montgomery just days after Brian Barrett's murder. Montgomery had tried to go about his life as if nothing had happened, maintaining the facade of normalcy, but the walls of his world were collapsing around him. The police arrested Montgomery at his home in Clarence, New York, the quiet, unassuming house where he lived with his wife Cindy and their two daughters became the final scene of a man whose double life had led to cold-blooded murder. When officers arrived to take him into custody, Montgomery didn't resist. Perhaps he knew that the lie had finally caught up with him. His initial reaction was one of shock and disbelief, but he offered little in the way of explanation or justification. Montgomery, the man who had lived so deeply in a fantasy world, now found himself face to face with the harshest of realities. He was charged with second-degree murder, a crime that carried the possibility of life in prison. As detectives interviewed him, Montgomery attempted to distance himself from the crime, claiming he had nothing to do with Brian Barrett's death. He tried to shift the focus away from his obsession with Jesse and his rivalry with Brian, but the evidence was too damning. The ballistics, the chat logs, the witness testimonies, and Montgomery's own increasingly erratic behavior in the days leading up to the murder painted a clear picture of premeditation and jealousy. The detectives didn't have to dig deep to find Montgomery's motive. It was all laid out in the months of online conversations he had with Jesse and the growing rage he felt toward Brian. As the police pieced together the motive, it became clear that Montgomery had been driven to murder by his obsessive belief that Brian had stolen Jesse's affections from him. His jealousy had festered to the point where eliminating Brian seemed like the only way to reclaim his fantasy life. In his mind, Brian was the final obstacle standing between him and Jessie, the woman who, in reality, didn't even exist as he believed her to. But the police understood that Montgomery's rage had been directed not at a real person, but at the crumbling illusion of Jessie, an illusion that had been maintained by a woman living her own lie. With Montgomery in custody, the legal process began. He faced a trial for the murder of Brian Barrett, and as the details of the case became public, the community was once again shocked by the twisted nature of the crime. The quiet, middle-aged man who had once seemed so unremarkable was now revealed as a killer, driven by online fantasies and deadly jealousy. Montgomery's arrest marked the end of his tragic, delusional journey, but for the families of both Brian Barrett and Montgomery, the pain and loss were only beginning. The internet chat room murder is a haunting example of how the anonymity and deception of the internet can warp reality and lead to catastrophic consequences. For Thomas Montgomery, the ability to create a false identity online as Marine Sniper allowed him to escape the drudgery of his real life and become the person he fantasized about being a young, strong, and desirable Marine. But that same anonymity also set the stage for his emotional and psychological unraveling. Living a lie online gave Montgomery a sense of power and control that he lacked in his real life. As Tommy, he could be admired, desired, and even loved, something that felt increasingly out of reach in his role as a middle-aged factory worker and father. The freedom to be whoever he wanted to be online blurred the boundaries between fantasy and reality for Montgomery. Each time he logged on to chat with Jesse, he was feeding the illusion that he could escape the mundane and relive his youth through this digital persona. But Montgomery wasn't the only one living a lie. Mary Sheeler, pretending to be her teenage daughter Jessie, was also wielding the power of internet anonymity to manipulate and control both Montgomery and Brian Barrett. Her deceit using her daughter's photos and playing the role of a flirtatious high school girl allowed her to live out her own fantasies of being desired by younger men. Mary's actions set the entire chain of events in motion, her lies fueling Montgomery's obsession and Brian's unwitting involvement in the deadly rivalry. The anonymity of the internet provided both Montgomery and Mary with the tools to construct alternate realities, but it also led to devastating consequences. For Montgomery, living a lie online wasn't just an escape, it became an emotional crutch, a way to validate his need to feel wanted and important. As his online relationship with Jesse grew more intense, his investment in the fantasy deepened. When Jessie began shifting her attention to Brian, it wasn't just the loss of a romantic interest. Montgomery felt as though his entire identity as Tommy was being threatened. The emotional fallout of losing that identity pushed him to act out violently, unable to separate his online persona from his real world actions. Psychologically, the impact of living a lie online can be profound. The freedom to create false identities can lead to feelings of empowerment, but when those identities start to crumble, the emotional toll can be devastating. In Montgomery's case, his sense of self-worth had become so tied to his identity as Tommy that losing Jesse to Brian felt like a personal failure. The fantasy world he had built, where he was the hero and the object of affection, collapsed around him, leaving only jealousy, rage, and desperation. The anonymity of the internet also makes it easier to dehumanize others. For Montgomery, Brian Barrett wasn't just a co worker, he was the embodiment of everything that stood in the way of his fantasy. The more Montgomery's feelings of jealousy and inadequacy grew, the less he saw Brian as a real person. In Montgomery's mind, Brian became an obstacle that needed to be removed, not a flesh and blood person with a life and future of his own. In the end, the online deceptions of both Montgomery and Mary Sheeler had deadly consequences. What began as a series of lies in an anonymous chat room spiraled into murder, leaving one man dead, another man in prison, and a community forever shaken. The case serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of internet anonymity and the psychological consequences of living a lie online. For Montgomery, the fantasy world he had created became his undoing, and the emotional fallout of that deception led to a tragedy no one could have foreseen. Thomas Montgomery's trial was the final act in a tragic and bizarre story, one that left the courtroom riveted by the details of how an internet fueled obsession spiraled into murder. The prosecution's case centered around the argument of premeditated murder, fueled by Montgomery's intense jealousy and his deteriorating mental state after losing Jesse's Mary Sheeler's attention to his younger co worker, Brian Barrett. The prosecution built their case around the notion that Montgomery's actions were calculated, motivated by his desire to remove his romantic rival and reclaim the fantasy world he had built with Jesse. Throughout the trial, key pieces of evidence were presented to the jury, including the chilling chat logs between Montgomery, Jesse, and Brian, which painted a vivid picture of the love triangle that had taken place online. The prosecution highlighted Montgomery's growing obsession with Jesse and his escalating hostility toward Brian as Jesse shifted her attention toward the younger man. The culmination of this jealousy was the murder of Brian Barrett, whom Montgomery shot 3 times in a cold-blooded ambush outside the factory where they both worked. The forensic evidence, including ballistics that linked the murder weapon to Montgomery and witness testimonies from co-workers who had noticed Montgomery's erratic behavior in the days leading up to the murder, strengthened the prosecution's case. They argued that Montgomery had carefully planned the killing, waiting for the perfect moment to ambush Brian when he was most vulnerable. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was Montgomery's own online conversations, which investigators recovered despite his attempts to delete them. These messages revealed a man who was unraveling emotionally, making veiled threats against Brian and showing signs of desperation as he tried to cling to the fantasy that had overtaken his life. The prosecution used these messages to demonstrate that Montgomery had not acted impulsively, but had been contemplating violence for weeks as his jealousy grew. The defense, for their part, attempted to portray Montgomery as a man caught in a web of deception, manipulated by Jesse Mary Sheeler and driven to his breaking point by the emotional turmoil he was experiencing. They argued that while Montgomery had indeed shot Brian, it was not premeditated murder, but an act of passion, fueled by the overwhelming emotions that had taken control of him. However, the prosecution's evidence of Montgomery's premeditation, particularly his online threats, proved too strong to counter. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury returned a verdict that sealed Thomas Montgomery's fate. The jury found Montgomery guilty of second-degree murder, concluding that his actions were indeed premeditated and driven by jealousy. While the defense had tried to argue that the murder was a crime of passion, the jury sided with the prosecution's case, which painted Montgomery as a man who had carefully plotted the murder of his romantic rival. The final sentencing was a sobering moment for all involved. Montgomery was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, a punishment that reflected the gravity of his crime. The judge noted that while Montgomery had clearly been emotionally troubled, it did not excuse the calculated nature of the murder. He had chosen to end a life because of an obsession that had spiraled out of control, and now he would spend the next 2 decades at minimum paying for that choice. The verdict brought some closure to Brian Barrett's family, but the loss of their son and brother was something they would never fully recover from. For them, justice had been served, but it could never undo the damage that Montgomery's actions had caused. Montgomery, meanwhile, showed little emotion during the sentencing, seemingly resigned to the reality that his fantasy world had led him down a path he could not escape. While Thomas Montgomery faced the full legal consequences of his actions, the role of Mary Sheeler in the tragedy remained a topic of heated debate. Mary, the real person behind Jesse, did not face any legal charges, but her deception played a central role in the events that led to Brian Barrett's murder. As Jesse, Mary had manipulated Montgomery's emotions, leading him to believe he was in a romantic relationship with a young, beautiful girl, only to cruelly shift her affections to Brian, fueling Montgomery's jealousy and rage. Though Mary's actions did not make her legally culpable for the murder, the moral implications of her deceit were undeniable. By pretending to be her daughter and stringing both Montgomery and Brian along, Mary had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately turn deadly. Her ability to hide behind the anonymity of the internet allowed her to toy with the emotions of two men, pushing them into a rivalry that escalated beyond her control. The public reaction to Mary's role in the case was one of outrage and disbelief. While Montgomery had pulled the trigger, many saw Mary as a central figure in the tragedy, someone who had manipulated vulnerable individuals for her own amusement. The fact that she faced no legal repercussions for her actions only added to the public's anger. For many, Mary Sheeler was just as responsible for the death of Brian Barrett as Thomas Montgomery, even if the law did not hold her accountable. The Internet Chat Room Murder, or Talhot Blonde case, serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of online anonymity, the psychological consequences of deception, and the devastating impact that living in a fantasy world can have on real life. At its core, this case reveals how easily people can become lost in the personas they create online and how the boundaries between reality and fantasy can blur with tragic results. For Thomas Montgomery, the anonymity of the internet allowed him to create a new identity, one that gave him the validation and excitement he felt his real life lacked. But living a lie online took a psychological toll, pushing him deeper into an obsession that consumed him entirely. When that fantasy began to crumble, Montgomery was unable to cope with the emotional fallout, and his desperate need to hold onto the illusion drove him to commit murder. The case also highlights the darker side of online relationships, where deception can flourish under the cloak of anonymity. Mary Sheeler's decision to impersonate her daughter Jessie was not just a harmless game, it was a manipulation that had deadly consequences. Her actions, while not legally punishable, expose the dangerous power dynamics that can arise when people hide behind false identities online. This case also underscores the emotional vulnerability of those who engage in these online deceptions. Montgomery's psychological unraveling, fueled by his need to be loved and desired, speaks to the fragility of the human psyche when exposed to the distortions of online personas. The more Montgomery invested in the fantasy of Jesse, the less he was able to function in reality, leading him down a path of jealousy, rage, and ultimately violence. In the aftermath of the trial, the key figures involved were left to face the consequences of their actions. Montgomery, now serving his sentence, will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars, haunted by the fantasy that led to his downfall. Brian Barrett's family continues to mourn the loss of their loved one, a young man who was drawn into a deadly rivalry through no fault of his own. And Mary Sheeler, though legally free, must live with the knowledge that her deceit contributed to the death of an innocent man. In the end, the internet chat room murder case stands as a grim reminder of the real world dangers that can arise from online deception. It highlights the psychological impact of living a lie and serves as a warning about the fragile line between fantasy and reality. The tragic outcome of this case is a testament to how easily lives can be destroyed when anonymity and deception take root in the digital world.